Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. For many of us approaching midlife, we kind of take a look back at our past to figure out why we are the way we are and what might happen in our future. We came across a wonderfully extensive book that I think is going to break a lot of myths that people might start waking up and taking more control of their lives, especially when it comes to the physical health and well-being. At first look, Brighton Baby, which is the title of the book and its extensive encyclopedic size, might kind of get people thinking, well, this is about babies. You know, it's an organic approach to having an extraordinary child. But after all, you were a baby once. And if you follow a lot of these methods in here, you'll find yourself on a fascinating journey to figure out that the fact that we're being told a lot of things that don't make any sense just need to be wiped away, and we have a better approach where we have also a better relationship with our doctor. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest, Dr. Roy Dittman, and we're going to be talking about his book, Brighton Baby. Dr. Dittman, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, good morning, Daniel.
Now, when did you start putting all of this together here? Because this is quite a bit of a book, and at first it's daunting, but you find as you start jumping into it, you can't stop turning the pages.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we find, although it's over a little bit over 1,000 pages, it's the result of over 30 years in my career as a perinatal specialist. And I've been focusing on just about everything I can find that would enhance our abilities to create children that can live up to their fullest potential, being happiest, healthiest, brightest children as possible. But not only that, we go into the subtleties of this emotional and mental and spiritual subtleties and importance of raising children to be ethical and moral beings and serving society and others. It's not just your typical chemistry, nutritional book or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
We look at the deeper aspects of who we are and why, how important children are to us in all cultures. I think in today's world it's particularly disturbing, as you know, that we're not really serving our children that well, like our grandparents did. So it's quite a different world today. And when I see children born with any kind of birth defect or autism spectrum disorder, and my first one was, it came to light that although I was eating a perfect diet, and so was his mother, we had blind spots, and we didn't see certain things. And even though I was a perinatal specialist here, and of course, because we were able to intervene early, we resolved his problems within 6.5 years, for the most part. But we wanted to get the word out to parents about this book. And like you're saying, it's not just for parents-to-be. There's many grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles that are buying this for their other family members, saying, you really need to read this book. And it's very exciting to see such enthusiasm about a book like this. We didn't know how it would be received. It's a bit controversial because we don't toe the party line that you hear on the mainstream media necessarily. But I think people get the fact that, when it comes to babies, we shouldn't be mixing drugs and we shouldn't be mixing questionable kinds of food sources and so forth, that we have to be much more careful. It's a different metric. Indeed, the embryological and fetal brain is much more susceptible to environmental toxins than our adult brain, and that's one of the distinctions we point out. So the book is easy to read. And most people say, like you just did, that it's a very enjoyable read, and I wrote it for that intention. I wanted people to be able to sit down with a cup of tea or whatever and just really enjoy reading this book and enjoy kind of talking to their partner about the kind of baby they want to create and family they want to have, and then go ahead and create it. Because on the other side of all of this is, once we get out of the red zone, talking about the damage it's hurting our kids, the other side of this book is all the things you can do that are in your own power to do now. And we focus on preconception and conception in this book because that's where we can make the biggest difference. And a lot of these things, as you know, we can't do once we're pregnant. Doing mercury detox or heavy metal detox or chemical detoxifications, parasite, liver, and colon cleanses during pregnancy is just, not practical or advisable. So that's why we wrote it this way. And we're getting good feedback from it from a lot of different circles and a lot of great excitement internationally, too.
Well, as you well deserve, and what I wanted to point out is, here on our program, I'd like to believe, at least from what I've experienced out there, we really try to bring on, as you said earlier, the book is controversial, and it isn't about bringing out something that's controversial. It's bringing out something that really captures people, tangles them up a little bit because they get so used to being on autopilot for their information, almost as though, I don't like to use this term, so I'll try to be very loose, but sheep looking for the water. And I remember myself back in the early part of the 1990s when it just seemed like there were a slew of books, of tapes, of CDs about diet and what the right diet and the right way to eat was. And I got to a point of aggravation, and I don't know why at that particular time something like that stirred me the way that it did. So I simply just used my, sense, and I went to the library and I just looked up diet, seen what kind of titles would pop up on the computer at the library, and there were more than almost 400 titles. And I just allowed the ones that really seemed to stand out and make the most sense to me. And those were the books that I pursued. And after getting my hands on a couple, I started to realize out there in the media that it seems that they're promoting the next best thing, so they call it. But then if you take a look at this next best thing, well, that was the best thing 5 years ago, so all of a sudden this is a new next best thing that's really old. It's just somebody promoting a new idea. And I began to see the pattern that it's about chasing down fads to create the kind of buzz that makes people kind of move forward, and really it isn't good solid information, or it might be, but not as much as we should get. A book like this, Brighton Baby, is kind of one of those where as people are throwing pebbles into the lake or the pond, if you will, to create little ripple effects, this is more like the boulder that splashes, sinks, and drains the pond and says this one stands completely alone. And these are the kinds of things we like to bring up on our radio program.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's very apropos for this discussion because, I remember in the 80s being in practice, and I was a team doctor in the Olympics as well, and in those days I was featured as Doctor to the Stars. I was very successful. And I remember this myth going around amongst many medical circles that the lower the cholesterol in your blood was, the healthier you were. And I worked with a lot of track and field athletes, marathon athletes, and I saw firsthand how unhealthy these long distance runners were, especially the females. They didn't have any period. They looked 15 years older than they were. And what really shocked me, though, Daniel, was so many doctors recommending during pregnancy that women have very low cholesterol. They thought that was healthy. And it seems like I was the only person in the forest screaming, saying, no, that's really unhealthy. Because, you need cholesterol to form hormones, and without proper hormones, your baby's brain can't form. And unfortunately, I saw so many children born with birth defects because their doctors were recommending these crazy fad diets like you're talking about. They read some book about having cholesterol to be as low as 100. In fact, I just talked to a patient of mine 2 weeks ago who said his doctor's goal was to get his cholesterol down to 100. I just think I can't believe this is still going on. I thought it had ended in the 80s. But it's still
gets into those Miami Vice suits.
Yes, so like you say, I wanted to, and our foundation wanted to write a book that gave parents as much tools as possible, such that by reading the book, even poor families, middle-class families, wealthy families could all enjoy something that was comprehensive in scope. And, of course, it's a beginning discussion. It's not everything. But it's a very good start. This is primarily focused on preconception and conception. Mm-hmm. The reason why is because my main focus has always been on preconception, because the most damage done to the fetal brain by heavy metals and other toxins is done in the first 3 months when the baby's, the spinal cord and the first part of the brainstem is forming. This is when toxins can be 100, 1,000 times more damaging to the baby. And so these kinds of distinctions, I point out, are what we focus on. We focus more on organizing the information such that it's usable, it's practical, and we give people a plan. So we never scare people in the book about an issue without giving them a practical pathway and a solution. So we actually also show them how to avoid that particular problem in very practical and as affordable ways as possible, by the way.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's the thing, so we can kind of take this into, I guess, a very unique direction for a bit. I know that we're planning to have you back on the program a couple of more times than we would need to with a book of this size, but just recently we featured Dr. Michael Goldberg, and he has a book out titled The Myth of Autism. And he's one of those, a lot like you, who is being bold about stepping in and saying, look, this is an epidemic, this isn't a developmental disorder that a lot of people are claiming that it is. We really need to take a look at this from a real point of view. And he's a pediatrician who started his practice in 1972. And he says, this is when you began to see this epidemic really begin to grow. And now you're seeing, what is it now? It's 1 in 50? I'm not really sure what the numbers are on something like this. And this is just over the course of 20 to 30 years. And this was something that, as I understand it, was almost unknown back in the early part of the 1900s. And, so he's approaching it from a viral point of view. He's saying, that this is a neuroimmune disorder, and as you had mentioned earlier, your own son, I believe it was, you were able to turn this around within 6 years. But that all being said, we take a look at the media when it comes to something like this, and they talk about birth defects and that there are these elusive factors that are out there that are out of our control. A lot of times you're hearing that it's genetic, that those are the things to blame. But as boldly as someone like you stating perhaps this is not true, that we need to look at this differently, he's saying the same thing. and it's unique to see that there are voices like yours out there that are saying, look, folks, this isn't a hopeless position to be in. And I have actually been to places where family go with their autistic children, like game nights and so forth, and you really see this sort of surrender, like they have just tried everything, and they just kind of have let go. They're just feeling like they've lost the fight. Tell us about what you think about those messages out there, especially when it comes to the ideal of birth defects, the elusive factors in the genes, and how we should really be looking at this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, although we call the book, a revolutionary organic approach to having an extraordinary child, it's not a new agey woo-woo book at all. In fact, we have about 1,500 scientific references, very solid references. And, I was...
Most woo-woo books aren't this big.
Exactly. Yes, and it's a lot of clinical experience, not just of mine, but around the world. I also did a lot of early brain development research with other scientists. I co-founded and founded 3 biopharmaceutical companies and directed research over 3 major U.S. universities. My father is a nuclear scientist, and my grandfather is a very famous aviator, one of the first astronauts. I was raised in a very scientific environment from birth, and yet I had experiences early on when I saw the horrible birth defects when I was 10 in the Central Valley due to pesticides. I was raised by a very liberal, open-minded family. Not necessarily politically liberal, because they always taught me, just have an open mind. Don't necessarily identify yourself with any particular opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Always be willing to change on a dime if somebody comes up and shows that what you think is not correct. So I like to look. My father taught me to look at everything, look at the facts only, and don't believe even scientists. Many scientists are living in their own kind of mythic world, in fact. And what you're saying about genetic birth defects, if we look at the facts, we see that many of these so-called trends towards autism that are blamed on genetics, just like the polio epidemic, we find that it correlates to the excessive use of DDT. Polio is a very clear, if you look at the graph, it's almost identical to the period when we thought DDT was safe in the 50s,
mm-hmm.
and we would directly spray entire classrooms with these huge fogs. They would just spray the children.
Classrooms? Really? I never even heard of anything like that.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
My goodness.
And you see that children started getting polio. And so as soon as they stopped doing that, it went down.
I'm sorry, that blows my mind.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, let's make sure the classrooms and the kids in them are healthy. We're going to spray them with DDT. Oh, my goodness.
So, see, oftentimes I think that that they're pointing to an area like a virus or something. And,
sure.
And indeed, viruses will come up or infections will come up when the immune system is suppressed by pesticides or heavy metals. And what we have today, and I point out in my grand theory of what's causing and correlating to autism today, is what's happening in the mass media is very deceptive. And I try to coach parents to ask the right questions scientifically. And I say, to be correct for most cases, you want to say correlate instead of cause. Now,
mm-hmm.
in some cases, there are causal factors, but that's a very meaningful word in science, and that's where sometimes they catch us. So I say, look, if we look in today's world, the way that, say, for instance, lead combines with something like mercury in our bodies is exponentially worse. For example, I'd like to give this example in the book where you see a lethal dosage of mercury and a lethal dosage of lead given to rats. You see that means that one rat will die out of 100 at that dose. Now, when scientists gave the same amount of each another group of rats, they expected only 2 rats to die out of 100, and most would, but instead they found all 100 rats died. And that's what's happening to our children today. And now think about this, is that we're living in a soup now of all kinds of toxins we don't know about. The average woman today has, in America, 232 chemical toxins in her blood. That's the average. So we have no idea how certain kinds of vaccination reactions with antibiotic use, with NSAID use, with GMOs, with aspartames, with all kinds of excitotoxins and processed foods combine in our children's brain and cause immense damage and suppress genes and delete genes. And then they point correctly that there's a gene problem. But that's like saying, somebody, it's your fault, you're shot, you're wounded, and to a liquor store owner that was just shot by somebody who was robbing him. It's like, you better clean up this mess, guy. I mean,
right.
That's what we're doing. So we're telling our children, oh, you have a genetic birth defect. Well, no shit. I mean, I'm sorry from the language, but, please, we're not that stupid.
Well, here's the thing I'd like to point out, too, Dr. Dittman, is this. It was about 6 months ago we featured, well, darn it, now I just lost the name, but anyway, Dr. Bruce Lipton. and his book, The Biology of Belief.
Yeah, I like Bruce. He's a good friend.
Yeah, well, that's good to know because you're the second time that I've actually been able to talk with someone who knows him directly. But I said, this is a great book, but it seems the New Age community hooked onto this, and they're talking about beliefs and manifestation. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's all well and good, but have you actually read what the book is about? Because for me, it took, and it opened up sort of a quantum leap in some ways, where I began to see, oh, this is what I always thought genetics was always about, that it's about, information that's not only changeable, but the fact is that it's also designed to learn and to protect an organism, to be able to thrive. And putting that in perspective, and then what you're talking about, you can see how this all makes sense. Because it's something that's even changeable in a lifetime. For instance, a person who lives in California, if they go and they move to Alaska, of course they're going to freeze to death on a 75-degree day up in Alaska. But within a couple of years, their genes will begin to change, and they'll be able to tolerate a 45-degree day where they probably would have never been able to get out of bed, a couple of years ago. That's how genetics usually works. Now, that may be a little oversimplified, but taking a look at the context of what we're talking about here, it makes a lot of sense that these genetics, the body was just trying to do the best it knew how to do in its surroundings to protect itself, to thrive the best way that it can. Is that a good way to put that?
Excellent. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And
well, Bruce actually said it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. That's really great because our genes are being influenced all the time by everything we do, even our thoughts and our emotions. In fact, I was just reading a study that was in New Scientist in February, and and this has been going on for some time in the mainstream scientific community. Scientists from the University of Cambridge and from Germany and from Sweden have been doing really interesting research, and also Russia, about how epigenetics from the past influence us today. And it's much more potent and real than they ever thought. And this is very mainstream science. This is not anything fringy at all. This is confirmed through gene testing. And so if our ancestors in the past lived through war or intense stress or famine or diseases or any kind of extreme conditions, our genes adapt to that, and they also can be suppressed 2 or 3 generations later. So in my opinion, what's going on today, Daniel, is that I think we have extreme neglect going on. Mm-hmm. I may go into some of the political aspect of this because I don't think it's actually separable at this point. That I'm trying to inspire parents and everyone to get involved in the political aspect, because we must confront this dragon right now. It's a really ugly dragon. I know it's not pleasant, but we must do it for the sake of future generations. And what I'm getting to is that we have neglected for many, many decades now blatant criminal, eating of our food chains, of the lying in the media, the complicitness of Congress, complicitness of corporations and big banks, and something that's causing the horrible epidemic of autism. Really look closer, and just not on the surface, you see that there's many different powerful forces that are spending a lot of money covering this huge scandal up. In my opinion, it's the greatest challenge that faces our nation today. Mm-hmm. And our forefathers were warned about such a thing. And I think that, especially at Autism One, I saw these Congress members, and I saw RFK Jr., and I saw the moms and the dads, and I saw them finally speaking to this issue and saying, we must stand up to this finally. And I've never been at a meeting like that. And I was saying, hallelujah, finally people are getting it, that we can no longer tolerate this. And I lived a lot in Europe. I lived in almost every country in Europe, or visited or stayed there at some point, or studied there. Because my father was a researcher, I got to live in a lot of places, and I was very fortunate. And one of the things I witnessed firsthand was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And despite what people think, because I was very up close to this, I knew the head of the KGB and his daughter. I knew the head of state, heads of state, the executive secretary to Gorbachev. I knew a lot of major players in Russia, and I still do. And what they knew was different from the story we're told in our media. We think what brought them down was the war in Afghanistan and Chernobyl, and that did contribute. But I would say that was more of a catalyst. What really brought them down was when the Russian people discovered that there was such criminal neglect in their industries that they were polluting their food chain with horrible heavy metals in the air, the water, the food. It was everywhere, causing horrific birth defects. 95% of the birth defects at the time were not from Chernobyl. Even in the 80s, when I was there too, I was there right after Chernobyl. These were actually caused by heavy metals, and so they actually forced their government people to resign. They were so furious. There were spontaneous riots that demanded the resignation of these corrupt officials who accepted money to allow polluting of their food chain. Mm-hmm. And they knew that these birth defects, these horrific birth defects, were happening in their children because of these criminal officials. And this is no different from what's happening in our country today. And that's why they're trying to blame it on your genes, They're saying, oh, look at your genes, or you got a problem with your genes there. Again, blaming the victim. And in truth, this has been going on for so long. You could look at a paper in the 50s and see it was going on then. And they just continually ignored it because there was such amount of money to be made. Mm-hmm. And there was wars to be fought. And there was other things to do that were more important than future generations. When a country does that, it's destined to fail, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So at some point we have to ask ourselves, how important is our comfort? How important is our comfortable lifestyle, getting a paycheck, compromising our moral and ethical standards, compromising our own spiritual, fortitude, really? Mm-hmm. Who are we if we can't take a stand for this really important issue? So I really am happy to speak with you and your wife, Joy, because we need to let everyone know that this is probably the most important challenge facing our country today, although it seems like there's bigger issues. The reason why we're here today is because of generation after generation that did everything they could to feed their children properly, make sure they were safe, to make sure that they had everything they could possibly have in terms of health care, to make sure that they grew up to be viable people in the world and enjoy this human life. Mm-hmm. And we've missed the boat somewhat, and we have to really catch up in this area. And I tell people, I don't care whether you're Democrat, Republican, Libertarian. This is something that it shouldn't matter. I don't care if what party they are. If they're not doing something about this issue right now, get them out of there. Throw those bums out of there and say, where do you stand about future generations? Because right now, nothing's happening, and we're not going to wait another 20, 30 years for a myopic, hyper nerdy, geeky scientist doing really abstract research, trying to blame it on our genes, waiting for some kind of hopeful answer is going to create some kind of autism vaccine. Forget it. That ain't going to happen. Mm-hmm. Let's get down to business and make a stand and do something about this now.
And one of the big things, we've talked about this on the program, cancer, and it's not to take this in a different direction, but this is really hitting on point of what we're talking about here is, you look at all the years that cancer research has been around. You look at all the millions, perhaps even billions of dollars that are being raised by people who do the walk and the run and the, let's produce a circus for the cure. And you have to wonder, how come they're no closer to a cure with all this money and all this time and all this research than they were 50 years ago. And when I had Suzanne Summers on the program, I actually boldly stated, I said, did you know cancer was cured back in, 1902 or '05 or something like that? And she was kind of blown away herself. And this was someone who produced a New York Times best-selling book called Breakthrough, which is about the alternative ways we can come to see how to, liberate ourselves from cancer, I guess. And she says, really, what is it? And she was surprised, and I said, well, this Dr. Otto Warburg, decided that what the cell needed was to be oxygenated and to be, I'm trying to think of the right word for water, hydrated, I guess it was. And I said, it's really kind of just that simple. And actually, when you take a look at how we approach this today, it's the fight, it's the war, and you kind of wonder as you bring the political aspect of it, and even in light as you were talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, that it seems our own country deliberately likes to continually create these battles of anxiety to distract us from really searching for the truth the way we should be.
Yeah. Well, that's a very deep and provocative discussion, and very interested in this, actually. And the truth is, we do know what is correlating and causing autism today.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot we can do, and that's one of the intentions I wrote the book with. Is I wanted to put something in people's hands that they read this book and understood it. They could make a huge difference in having a family that not only free of any kind of birth defects or autism, but extraordinarily healthy and intelligent and happy children. And I think that, you see, there's a whole industry arising right now from the autism epidemic, and I think it's a bit obscene. I want to see this go around, although there's 1 in 38, I think, is the latest statistics. It's hard to keep track of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just changing every 3 months.
I remember it was like 1 in 88 last year.
Yes,
it's getting ugly is what it is.
Yes, we're in that hockey stick, really huge spike right now, and it's getting much worse very fast, actually. And we're at that point where we really have to intervene. We have to have some kind of radical intervention. And so I talk to doctors and scientists from all over the world, and one thing I'd like to share with you is I've got some very big interest from Hong Kong and Chinese and from Japan, medical scientists there, and they call me up and they say, I really love your book. This book has never been written like this, and they're coming over here to meet with me, and it's very interesting what they're doing. One scientist over there, he said, all I do is remove heavy metals from the parents before they conceive, and the children are all super babies. They're like super smart.
Super babies, I like that.
That's what they call them over in Asia. It's not what we call it over here, but that's their term for this.
And here they're known as a deduction.
So it's like so just doing that one thing, Daniel,
mm-hmm.
makes that much difference. So that gives you an example. If we just take the burden of these toxins off our children's brains and their nervous systems, they extraordinarily develop. It's incredible. And I tell parents, it's not as hard as you think. I mean, look at our parents. What did they do before they conceived us? Not that much,
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, they had less toxins. They didn't have as much of a biological burden. And that's what's changed, and that's what's, increasing, actually, all the chemicals and so forth. But as you said, people knew about this a long time ago. You can see there was a presentation before Congress talking about how we're depleting our soil and how minerals in the soil are the key to our genetics. And I'm like, wow, they did this in 1936,
Right.
It was like, and then you can see Rachel Carse's speeches to Congress in the 50s, warning us of DDT and chemical poisons and heavy metals then, and said, you must do something about this now. It's going to get much worse. And she knew the military-industrial complex was going to, ignore this issue. They had their own goals to meet. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I grew up in a Lockheed family. And I'm very proud of that. And all my uncles and my dad and, aviators, and they always racing cars and motorcycles and airplanes when they were when we were very young. And that's a great thing, except that sometimes, there's a lot we could have done that was so simple in those days to make sure that these toxins didn't touch our children's brains.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to roll this back and demand change from Congress, because it's not something that's even on their agenda. If you took a poll and said, here, put the 100 most important things that you must accomplish as a congressman or woman, I bet it may not even show up on their list to make sure that these things don't get into our children's brains. They might say, oh, let's look at this autism issue, but their idea of that is throwing more money at some philanthropic, fake philanthropic cause that's not going to really help our children again. And we're back to space one again. And there's a lot of distraction. There's a lot of disinformation being thrown out on the blogs right now by people in the pharmaceutical industry. It's very deceptive because there's a lot at stake. When you look at a pharmaceutical company that's making profits of $35 billion a year, and I've been in that world, I know what it's like. These companies would come to us to process their vaccines. And, so I know what goes on. I know the dark side of this area.
We actually produced a segment about 3 years ago from a gentleman who was 30 years in the industry and talks about how it works.
Wow.
Pretty amazing stuff.
I'd like to hear that one, too.
Yeah. No, it could have been 4 years ago, but we brought him on. I can't remember what his book was about, but he talks about the history of how the pharmaceutical companies came about. It was about managing pain, and then he started evolving the conversation throughout the book and talked about, these are the things these people do. Anyway, so again, like we said, that's another discussion. But
well, yeah, on the other side, on the light side of all this, parents come to me all the time, and I've been doing this for 30 years, and they always say the same thing. I'm like, I'm so glad I did this. I had no idea it was this powerful. I had no idea that I could have a child like this. And I hear this again and again. So parents never regret having done this, but unfortunately many parents regret having not done it that I used to speak with, because there's just not much validation in the media. They think to themselves, well, how come my OBGYN says this, or how come my doctor didn't tell me about this, or how come I've never heard of this before, and how what kind of a degree do you have? And we live in a kind of a brand name degree society right now. We just kind of like almost worship scientism, and there's nothing wrong with science, with real science, but when science becomes so abstract and so removed from the common good and the common benefit of future generations, that they can't see the forest for the trees anymore, and they can't see the practicalities anymore, that what we need to do is right in front of us, and we can go right down to the health food store and get the things we need. We can do this. We really can. And when I see fathers get involved, they just get so excited. And usually the mothers say, oh, he's not interested in any of this, And I say, well, you watch. You'll see. Because I know men, and I talk to men, man to man, father to father, and I say to them, look, right now it's hard for you to relate to this. I know you think this is all, your wife's area, domain, and rightly so. We don't give birth to children. We don't breastfeed them. But when fathers realize that they can make this huge difference, preconception, and they can make an enormous difference, they really get into this, even more than the moms, believe it or not. And they actually become, just experts at this. And they, especially when they see their first baby born, and once they start seeing that baby develop, then they get really inspired. and then they want to have another one. It's like, wow, this really worked. This is amazing. This is a lot of fun. I mean,
it's more fun, than making the baby. It's actually having it now.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fun parts in the book, by the way. We go into sexology and how to conceive a baby in the best way, and there's a lot of fun parts as you talk about, and we talk about some of the things that I figured, like if I was a parent, and, I am a parent. I have 4 kids myself, and but if I'm listening or reading this book or program, what would I want to hear that maybe I don't know about? And I wrote it in that way that there's no fluff in this book. I tried to really hone it down, even though it's big. I just honed it down to what are the critical things, what are the most important things that parents really need to know right now to turn this epidemic around.
Mm-hmm.
And then I said, please share this with everyone you know, with all of your relatives, coworkers, everybody you know, because it's going to make such a big difference. And those people who you share this with, even your enemies, will become your best friends. You watch. Once you share this information with them and they utilize it, they're going to see, they'll be shocked. Every time they're shocked, like, oh my God, how did such a beautiful baby come out of us? It's like,
right.
And I'm my wife and I, we're not ugly people or anything, but I often all 4 of our children, we take them to the store, and people often will say, well, "Is that your baby?" Because much more beautiful than us, And we said, "Yep, it's our baby." So we're kind of used to it, But I tell parents, I said, get used to this because this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we want to happen. We want our children to have a much better life than we did. And that's what we're trying to do. This is just a beginning conversation.
Right.
In this book. I invite scientists and doctors from all over the world to participate, and we're starting an international congress on perinatal medicine. We're teaching hospitals are already cooperating with us all over the world. Unlike America, people in many countries are already there. They said, hey, you already had me when I read the table of contents. They're like, how do we get started like tomorrow? Like, let's get going,
You had me at marine plasma, for instance.
Exactly.
What I'd like to do, due to the time that we have left, is really kind of strengthen and focus and hone in on, I know we were talking about autism and Asperger's, but we'll touch on that a little bit more, but mostly talk about certain things people can kind of do and certain questions and ways they can pursue this that might help pull them out of the fog, the dark. And because I know you certainly, from this book, had my wife bouncing all over the walls, and she got a hold of this marine plasma, which is one of these things we'll talk about here in a bit. But what I'd like to focus on, too, because you've talked about heavy metals, and I'm certainly with former guests, we've approached this as well. But the other thing, too, because of Jenny McCarthy, whom a lot of people know as former Playboy centerfold and, actress, but she has a son who was autistic or on the Asperger's syndrome. And she went out, and her battle cry was that it was about immunizations. Now, I know from my experience just a few years ago that my wife's son, who was in his mid-teens, he was generally kind of a shy and kind of a quiet kid. But he ended up getting cut doing a job, and so he went in and apparently was given a tetanus shot. But in reviewing his record, realized that he was behind in his immunizations and decided to basically laden this kid with 6 or 7 vaccines all at once. Now, I can tell you unequivocally, and in knowing this kid for as long as I have, that slowly but surely this kid literally started going into a fog. He started just disappearing. You could just see it. Not overnight, but it was happening very gradually. And within 6 months of when that started, was becoming at times violent, isolating himself in his bedroom in the dark 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we were just astounded by this. What's going on here? You can't say that's developmental. Now, I'm not pointing the finger, but I had actually approached this question with Dr. Michael Goldberg, again, in his book, In the Myth of Autism. He says, inoculations are necessary for, against the dreaded diseases, but he says it's really about how we're doing it. And he says, now, for instance, you talk about the idea of vaccinations with pregnant women and infants, and I heard they're even vaccinating infants as young as 6 months old, and I thought, are these people out of their minds? But let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit and what your thoughts are on that.
Well, this is an entire show, but
I know, but just
that's a very intense subject. I have not vaccinated any of my 4 children,
mm-hmm.
and I intentionally expose them to illnesses. I take them into Chuck E. Cheese's with the kids with their snot, and I running down their face, and I'd go play with those kids over there. And then
So you follow the George Carlin method, in other words. If you drop the food on the floor, pick it up. That's how you become immune.
Yeah,
which I agree with, actually.
Well, yeah, and within limits, of course. But
mm-hmm.
I point out in the book, I give parents practical solutions. I long ago studied with world experts on hygiene and immunology, and I studied with some really brilliant doctors as well in this area early on in my career. And I tell parents to just take some iodine and salt, put them in the bathtub. It's in the book, the way you do it. It's very simple. It's super cheap. And my kids had all these things, mumps, chicken pox, measles, all the scary names. And we travel all over the world, get exposed to all kinds of pathogens, and I've never seen it fail. Now, that's not the only thing I do. I also give parents other tools. So I say, look, there is an appropriate time to vaccinate. If there's a cholera outbreak in the next town and 50 people have died, you should get a cholera vaccine. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But if your chances, the chances of your child having, these diseases are 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, or let alone dying of the disease is even higher sometimes, 1 billion or 2 billion. It doesn't make sense because the chances of that child getting autism right now is 1 in 38.
Right.
For boys, for instance. It doesn't make any sense, for one thing. And I recommend that parents do the opposite of what many physicians are recommending, and that is that I recommend that they strengthen children's adapt to these pathogens. And I think they should be exposed and methodical in an intelligent way. And so there's many things that can help that. And Keentown marine plasma is one of those things that helps your immune system to adapt to these pathogenic challenges. And our immune system is built to adapt. It has an intelligence. It's like a second brain, really.
Mm-hmm.
And if we give it the opportunity by getting very high dosage, super strain, human strain probiotics into our children's guts and throughout their whole body, those microbes know what to do. They evolved with us, and to a certain extent, I believe we're at their mercy. But if we strip their cellular immunity and strip their immunity in their gut by giving antibiotics for many generations now, and if doctors continue telling women, as they told my great-grandmother, that modern women do not breastfeed, then the children don't have that kind of immunity. They continue doing cesarean sections at 45% in many counties in the United States today. Not an emergency, but the true intention of it is. And then you don't get the probiotics from the mother's system. Those things, we're not giving the child the opportunity to adapt and strengthen the immune system to the pathogens that are present in the world today. It doesn't really have the opportunity like our grandparents had. And so, my dad grew up in Wisconsin, upper Wisconsin. It's very cold, and he's just really tough. You know, he had his own P-51 plane when he was 15. You know, I come from these testosterone-driven family that a little bit nutty, actually. And,
large and in charge.
Yes, exactly. And he always looking like he would do. I used to think my dad was trying to kill me. I'm just kidding, of course, when I was younger, because he used to have me do crazy stuff, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just normal for him. But now today, I said, Dad, you were grown up. You know, you grew up with raw milk, and the reason why you have a stronger system than I do is that I grew up on processed food, you know. In fact, I tell people jokingly, I'm doing this today because I have to make up for the karma for being. I was a child actor, and I used to do Hostess Twinkie commercials, you know. So the generation I grew up with. Ironically, my parents wouldn't let me eat, luckily, Hostess Twinkies. They knew that much, at least. But, you know, unfortunately, many parents do. So, you know, this discussion around vaccinations, the other thing that we need to look at is the graphs that if I just showed people the real graphs, the graphs that showed when group immunity took place long before the vaccinations were ever introduced, that alone shifts people's opinion. As soon as they take a look at those graphs, and I showed this to my father, and at first he was incredulous. He said, I don't believe that. That's not possible. You know, scientists would never lie like that. And so I got the actual first studies and showed him the real graphs, and he looked at me and said, oh my God, this is scientific fraud. I said, yes. How? He said, serious. You know, he was one of the co-founders of the World Federation of Scientists and Scholars, you know, and serious scientist, and he admitted to me, he says, this is right, this is scientific fraud. They are lying. The media is complicit in this lie. Very serious lie. Oh, I get it. So it took him many, many years of me talking to him for him to. I had to show him this graph. I couldn't find the right one. Finally got the right one. I showed him the right study, and I showed him what was going on, and he was really shocked. He says, "Now I know what you mean." And for my father to say that, because he's very orthodox, very, you know, party line science, you know, was you know, a turning point for him. And he loves his grandchildren, and he loves them. And he said, "Well, I agree with you." He said, "It's like, you know, you're doing the right thing with these kids. They're great kids." And so, you know, today we have to take a step back and put our opinions aside and look at the evidence. The evidence clearly shows that scare tactics of showing, you know, when I was a kid, you remember, you know, I'm 57. When I was a kid, they used to scare us with these, like, children in these iron lungs, and they couldn't move their head, and this is going to happen to you unless you get that polio vaccine. And they, you know, they scare us today with all these horrible stories of children dying if they don't get their vaccination shots and so forth. And you know, there is some truth to that, and there's some truth that inoculating children is important. But I go into the book about how you can inoculate your child in the proper way, in consultation with your holistic doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's ways that you can do this. And you know, I was threatened to have my kids all removed from school, and I would say, "Look, do you have a bond to cover the damage from this vaccination?" "Oh, no." "Here you go. Here's the form." "Do you have, you know, where you know, do you have any scientific references that show that this vaccine works?" "No, we don't." I said, "Okay, well, I'm not going to vaccinate my child." And so they stopped threatening to not allow my children into school, and they stopped threatening to not allow them even to have textbooks. I mean, really harassing calls where they're calling me twice a week saying, "You will not be allowed to enter your children in school." I said, "You got to be kidding. I grew up in the school system. My father's taught in the school system all the way through, and you're telling me they can't go." You know, there's healthy as can be. There's no threat to anybody. And so you know, they changed on the spot. And I sat down and talked to the principal, and she said, "I agree with you. They just have this policy. They're forcing us to do this." I said, "I know. It's not your fault." But we had an intelligent discussion about this. And I tell parents, I said, read. We have a chapter called, Educate Before You Vaccinate, an informed choice. And learn that chapter backwards and forwards. Show people those graphs. It really changes people on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
And they really see where we're at today. Don't be bullied by these scare tactics. Look at the Gardasil. Oh my God! I remember talking to the scientists who were hiding from Merck when they were about to warn the world way back in the mid 2000s. And when they came to our lab and they were hiding, and they said, "This is fraud. This is horrible. It's going to kill a lot of girls." And they were the lead scientists. They defected. They said, "We're trying to tell the media and warn people, don't take this Gardasil. It's going to damage a lot of girls. This is horrible. It's going to get approved. They're going to rush it through." And I remember talking to them at length and going, "Oh my God, this is horrific." And I think soon afterwards, Texas said they're going to mandatory Gardasil vaccination for all little girls, 11 years old, 12 years old. This is getting out of control. This is getting pretty nutty, in my opinion. So, to introduce the other thing, Daniel, that I would just want to point out is that this is the first time in human history we're introducing 36 vaccinations, sometimes before they're 1 year old, directly into their bloodstream. I think that's just not necessary, and most of these vaccinations are really not necessary. And I tell people, at least if you do it with a doctor who's going to do it in one at a time, not in these groups. Ways to do it that are less harmful.
Mm-hmm.
Prepare your child as well for that, so that it has a minimal amount of damage, if you do decide.
With about 3 minutes that we do have left in the program, although I wished I could go on for another hour, but that's just kind of how we are with the time. And Brighton Baby, this is one of the things that my wife, of course, has been bouncing off the walls with. In 1900, there was a French explorer by the name of René Quinton, and discovered a unique form of seawater. Now, we talked about this just a little bit, but talk a little bit more about what that's all about. I know it's just a short period of time, but do the best you can a little bit.
Yes,
this was a superfood here.
He was an amazing person. He was one of the first aviators. He funded the Wright brothers, in fact, and he discovered these huge plankton blooms, and he collected this water from the zooplankton consuming the phytoplankton. This viscous fluid, he said, is what's evolving us now. And indeed, he proved again and again that it's identical to our own blood. In fact, in Physiology 101, every medical student learns that our blood evolved from seawater.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, it's probably the most powerful thing I've ever used as a tool clinically, Daniel. I don't get paid by the company. I used to run that company, actually, for 3 years, so I know a lot about it. And I talked to scientists all over Europe and doctors before I agreed to run it. But I was so impressed because of my area as a perinatal specialist, what it did for children. Because René Quinton has over 10,000 cases where he would take mothers with the worst birth histories you can imagine, deformities, birth defects, miscarriages, all kinds of problems, and he would give them the marine plasma, and they would have perfectly healthy children every time, one case after another. This was well documented way back in the early part of the century. Because there was so much clinical and scientific evidence for this product, it was in the French PDR, it was used as a blood plasma in World War I, it was used by the French Army as a blood plasma and other armies. Indeed, it's profound in what it does for children, babies, and pregnant moms. It's totally safe. Not only is it safe for pregnant moms, it clears up morning sickness. I've seen it again and again. Now, I've only seen a handful of cases like this, but it's not enough. It's not a large study. But I'm getting confirmation from other doctors, and it was one of the things that was a huge problem for me because I could never figure out, how to solve this problem. But I've seen even severe morning sickness turning around within days.
Mm-hmm.
At first I thought, it's just a coincidence. Couldn't be that simple. But it actually is. And I'm very encouraged by this. Again, we have to do a longer study with much larger numbers. But Rene Cantone took these worst birth histories and showed that by taking this marine plasma, it's informing the epigenetic environment. Because think about it, everything, all the minerals in the organic form are in seawater, and all the microenzymes, synergists, symbiotics, cofactors, gene fragments of everything that's ever lived on our planet, lives today, is informing your immune system when you take this. And that's why I say if there's one thing, the Hail Mary pass, when people call me up and say, Doctor, I've read your book, read your checklist, I've done everything wrong. What do I do now? I'm about to have a baby. I said, take ketone marine plasma. It will reduce the chances of your having a birth defects, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this. 150 years of evidence shows that it works really well. So I'm glad you mentioned this product, because it's one thing I tell people. I said if there's anything I like to encourage people to take during pregnancy and before and after is the ketone marine plasma. It is very effective. It's very simple. It's extremely safe. Nothing can possibly go wrong. And you're going to have the chances of having a good outcome and birth outcome are maximized.
I think for our next show, what we can talk about are superfoods, things people can find within their reach that are extremely affordable that will bring you amazing results. But I think what's interesting about the marine plasma that you were just talking about, Quinton marine plasma, is that you said you can take this, it's safe, and there wasn't a litany of devastating side effects up to and including death like we so often hear on television commercials when it comes to a pill for something that you may have. We're not sure you have, but if you do, you might want to take this. I've just been astounded that, it seems that when you see these commercials or even read these advertisements,
yes,
that it seems that the side effects,
absolutely,
the list is longer than what's supposed to do for you. It's like, why would anybody do anything like that?
Exactly, and I've seen, I'm serious, my children always get over these things within 2 days. And I tell people, and they can't believe me. They said, no, that couldn't be. And then I said, try it, you'll see. And they're astounded. They always call me up and say, oh, my God, this is that simple? Taking this stuff and giving them probiotics, it takes them. I've even had many parents who said, look, my child's in a coma. Just had a vaccination reaction, and antibiotics and NSAIDs, the trifecta for autism. I said, give them super strain probiotics, give them the ketone isotonic, boom, they come out of the coma. So far, they've all come out of the coma and recovered because they acted immediately. And so I tell parents that study this book. You never know when you're going to need to use some of these things in an emergency. And what to do.
Well, it's certainly a wonderful, extensive book. Again, I look forward to having you back on the program several times. We hope that you'll want to do that as well with us. The book is Brighton Baby. It's the complete guide to preconception and conception, and it really should say and beyond. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece of work. We're certainly enjoying it. Our guest today, Dr. Roy Dittman. Is there a website people can find out more?
Yes, you can go to brightonbaby.com. The book's available pretty much everywhere these days.
Okay.
I want to thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure. It's my favorite subject to talk about.
Yep, and we'll have many more, I'm sure. Thank you again for being on the program.
All right.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. If you didn't get that down, it's brightonbaby.com is the website. You can find out more about this extraordinary way that you can arm yourself, not just with the information that is so vital this day and age, of course, with all the misinformation or disinformation that I'm sure a lot of us encounter, especially when it comes to the Internet, but finding out the real truth so you take the proper steps to do the right thing, because ultimately our future generations depend on it. Also, be sure to visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do have a free weekly e-news update that we encourage you to sign up for as well. We'll have a post there for Brighton Baby as well.